Welcome to part 2 of our, we were saying earlier, our coming out party, our quinceañera, our bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, sorry, gender. So we are at the Racialized and Gendered Body panel. That first panel was fabulous, wasn't it? I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, and like the previous panel, we have folks that speak different languages, that come from different campuses, and we're just so excited to have you all. Thank you. Oh, and it's 10 minutes each, and then questions, okay?
Hi, all. My name is Samantha Pinto. I'm Associate Professor of English and of African American Studies here at Georgetown on main campus at the college. And I just, like everybody else, just want to thank the folks who are doing the hard work of building the Gender and Justice Initiative. Thank you guys for doing this work and for organizing. And what I will talk about today is is part of my second book project, which is called Infamous Bodies, Early Black Women's Celebrity and the Culture of Human Rights. It's partially, this chapter, in fact, was sponsored by an NEH summer stipend grant, so I want to thank them in public and, you know, publishing forums for that. And the central argument of the book is that these Black women celebrities of the 18th and 19th century and Black women in general are more central to the formation of our ideas of rights and freedom than we usually think of, rather than just their margins or their antithesis, right? They're central to the actual formation. And that tracing some of their genealogies can also alter our investments in those concepts in our current day politics. So it looks at both these women in their own day, and then also traces them up through the kinds of what I call corrective histories that they, and work that they do in our politics after that. So today I'm going to be talking about Saartjie Baartman, who was otherwise known as the Hottentot Venus. I'll mostly be talking about her in her own, actually in her own day today as I cut the paper instead of some of her further iterations. So Saartjie Baartman is perhaps the most globally overexposed sign of Black women's sexuality and sexual subjection. The excruciating accounts of Baartman's racist exhibition, classification, and study linger as exceptional stories of racial horror. My work thinks about Baartman's representational legacy, though, as a way to articulate Black women's political subjectivity in relationship to the promise of contract, perhaps the most fundamental legal tool of the modern nation state. If democracy promised consent to be ruled as its ideological political foundation, contract was the post-emancipation tool, as historian Amy Drew Stanley notes, meant to bring this register of consent in line with democratic practice. Both free labor and marriage are transformed by the affective force of contract as an agreement between equals regarding both divisions of labor and corporeal and financial protections. Baartman, perhaps the subject of Black feminist theorizing around sexuality, is central to the formation and critique of the power of contract to produce something like equality or equitable relations in the contemporary world. Legally free on British soil, this is Baartman, Baartman stood as the test case to the limits of the labor contract within the context of emancipation in a radically inequitable social, political, and economic sphere. So shortly after Baartman began her, don't worry about it, her London performance in 1810, a group of abolitionists convinced a British court to serve a writ of habeas corpus, which is charges of false imprisonment, to Baartman's managers, one of whom was her master/owner in Cape Town, where she came from. At issue in this case was whether it was possible for Baartman to truly consent to an employment contract with those who had so recently held her in bondage in what is now known as South Africa. A study of the public trial in which she appeared as a witness merges justifications that underpin the chattel slave trade with contemporary conversations about the effectiveness of the law as an avenue of justice for Black subjects, for immigrants, for women, and for those involved with human trafficking. The trial surrounding Baartman's possibly coerced presence in London complicated public understandings of the relationship between colonial violence and employment for the displaced and free, in emerging exploitative markets for labor that one had little choice but to participate in if one was to survive. The trial also touches on the market for women's bodies that the modern West has either refused to regulate or made subject to the official protections of contract, putting women's work, in particular domestic, performative, and sex work, outside of the protective bounds of the state, and yet subject to its social and often criminal judgment. My longer work on her, the longer chapter, flows through representations of her trial in cinema, drama, and fiction before it follows the international human rights argument for the repatriation of her bones to South Africa, and it finally interrogates the limits of the critical contract she represents in terms of freedom and unfreedom in Black feminist discourse. But today, again, I'll talk mostly about the trial. Saartjie Baartman, born in the late 1770s, was born during an era of violent transition when the Ganakwa segment of her Khoikhoi linguistic group was moving from a pastoral social organization to one marked by the settler colonialist Dutch overtaking their land. It is due to this violence that Baartman was displaced to Cape Town in the first place, where she began serving as a domestic indentured servant to families, even as her firstborn child had passed away. It is one of her masters, Hendrik Caesar, now actually thought to be a free Black man who had made good in the multicultural, bustling trade town of Cape Town, made good being in quotes, who had gotten, who had purchased his own freedom, who, along with a white surgeon for enslaved laborers named Peter Dunlop, shepherded Baartman into service as a performer in London. After receiving papers to travel from the magistrate, Baartman arrived in London, causing a sensation for almost a year, when she then disappears in the provinces of England, likely due to a pregnancy, the only marker of which is her baptism and marriage certificate, most likely to Dunlop himself, which I'll talk about in a moment. When her exhibition failed to take off again, Baartman seems to have resumed performing amongst a group of other self-managed acts until she moves to France and is sold to do private shows with a circus owner / animal trainer, who subsequently sends her to scientist / naturalist Georges Cuvier, who documents her as an anthropological specimen in life, and then in 1815, after what is assumed to be succumbing to acute alcoholism, in her death. Her remains, including organs, bones, and a cast made of her body, remained on display until the 1970s in the Museum of Man in Paris, and were repatriated after a protracted battle between governments for a public burial in South Africa in 2002, which is now a tourist site for the Free State. So in Elizabeth Alexander's poem about Baartman, she has her speak the language of contract. I quote, "I left Cape Town with a promise of revenue," end quote, the narrator offers, a decidedly unpoetic line in its engagement with the negotiations of capitalism in between stanzas about London skies and damask plums. As law and literature scholar Carla Holloway argues, though, a contract is a legal form of promise. It has all the components of a fiction. The affective and representational work of contract transitions the terms of enslavement with human beings as property into consenting equal parties without resource distribution. This is not to deny workers' rights as an incredibly important strain of social justice under modern history, but to say that as a covenant, a promise between individuals, contract affords protection mostly to the moneyed entity, and it affords the fiction of liberal humanism choice under the guise of equality for the laboring body. The fiction of Baartman as a discrete subject who either can or cannot consent, or can possess or not possess agency, in sort of the rhetoric, the political rhetoric of my field, is also constructed as her performative act. Baartman performed in a role as a captured savage, in quotes, even as she was living her non-laboring life in London, receiving famous visitors. And both performances of self were necessary to expose at her trial, either claiming the performance as a fiction, right? She had consented to performing in this role, or claiming it as a truth, right? That in fact she was enslaved and captive, and they just put that on display for the crowd. My term, the contracted body, then also exposes the fiction of the social contract. So Rousseau infamously argues that that man, in his terms, exists naturally in a state of complete freedom, but that individual freedom is saturated with violence and radical vulnerability. In compromising and agreeing to a social contract, in his terms, humans agree to give up some degree of individual liberty to a sovereign body. They consent in order to gain a measure of security, including secured property rights for all. Charles Mills has infamously unpacked said contract as a racial one between whites to secure white supremacy, and Carol Pateman exposes the social contract as well as one between men, in Eve Sedgwick's terms. Contract then functions as both a social, as both a specific material document between parties, as well as a structure and a metaphor for all social relations and organization. The habeas corpus trial involving Baartman as the wrongfully imprisoned, rightfully contracted body calls attention to the fictions of the material contract in light of the context and conditions of social relations in which Baartman is supposed to be able to consent to her labor. Baartman is then a contracted body, an intersectional subject who constructs herself and is constructed through and by discourses of law, capital, labor, embodiment, and choice. Rather than assuming Baartman as either the victim or the resistor to some of the more unsavory desires named under this constellation, this paper and my chapter argues that contracted body can suggest both a state of subjection, but also the material, social, and temporal nexus where Baartman is our founding conceptual figuration of labor relations, rather than a terrific exception or gray area. Baartman's role in this trial shows the perils in considering sexual contracting as violating a moral and corporeal contract only, and not considering the ways that women's negotiations of freedom, or something akin to freedom in the words of Harriet Jacobs, were necessarily private due to their exclusions from large swaths of the public, political, and legal spheres. Baartman then represents not the exception to subjects under or in contract, but the paradigmatic contracted body in her less emphasized role as the litmus test between enslaved and free labor. Thank you. I forgot a pen.
Sorry, just because I think I'm in the screen. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So I just want to add my thanks to the organizers. I'm really happy to be part of this community, and I'm now that I've heard your paper, really excited to be in this conversation because you'll hear that there's a lot of uncanny resonance, and so I'm excited about that. I'm just going to begin reading. Late one evening in the summer of 1925, Dinsha Gudyali was walking back to his hotel room in Portland, Oregon, when he had the distinct feeling that he was being followed. He had just completed a demonstration of his invention before a small audience. Gudyali was the proud inventor of a therapeutic light box. Any disease, he claimed, could be cured by simply casting colored lights on the ailing body. And his little invention had been a surprising success, at least until recently. That night, Gudyali dragged his unsold instruments back to the hotel without assistance that he badly needed, his secretary having suddenly disappeared the day before. At the hotel, he was greeted by a federal officer pointing a gun at him. Several others flooded the room. He was ordered to strip. As Gudyali complied, another stepped on his toes. He spent that night in jail. It wasn't until the following morning that he had learned that he had been arrested for the notorious crime of white slavery. So the White Slave Trafficking Act of 1910, better known as the Mann Act, as many of you may know, criminalized interstate travel with white women for any, quote, immoral purpose. Now, the express purpose of the law was to protect women, especially white women, from being forced into prostitution, but its notoriously expansive wording allowed police and prosecutors to selectively punish men involved in all manner of consensual behavior, particularly black and brown men involved in relationships with white women. In 1925, Gudyali was accused of having sex with his secretary, a 23-year-old woman named Geraldine McCann, on 3 occasions, once on a summer vacation with Gudyali and his family, and twice while traveling by train from New Jersey to Oregon. At his trial, when Gudyali's attorneys asked the young secretary why she continued to work for Gudyali after the first alleged encounter, she explained that she had been mesmerized. So Gudyali immigrated to the U.S. from India in 1910. He became a citizen in 1917, the same year that Congress barred further immigration from the whole of Asia. He had been arrested several times during his career for violating laws regulating the practice of medicine, still an emergent profession at the time. But it wasn't until he married a white woman in 1923 that he became the target of increasingly racialized persecution. So in his autobiographical writing, much of it devoted to retelling his many encounters with police officers and prosecutors, Gudyali boasts that he was in fact a mesmerist, quote, well known, as well as a theosophist and a metaphysician and a telepathist and an all-around spellbinding speaker. He, like many others at the turn of the century, found in spiritualist counterpublics a form of entertainment, a community of free thinkers, and opportunities to investigate capacities of the mind and interpersonal exchange. And like many others, especially women and racialized others generally excluded from the more respectable professions, Gudyali found in spiritualist circuits a way to earn a living. So Gudyali first met his secretary, Geraldine, in 1924 when she and her aunt, herself a proclaimed theosophist, attended one of his lectures in Oregon. In Gudyali's account, the young woman seemed excited by his work, impressed by the professionalism of his younger wife and daughter from a previous marriage, and she seemed eager to travel the country. She willingly agreed to come live and work with them in New Jersey. In the prosecution's account, however, following a standardized white slavery script, Gudyali had lured the young woman away from her home into his precinct, where he exercised total control over her. This is some of her testimonies. The prosecution made much of what they kept referring to as their curious contract, the employment contract. So soon after leaving Portland to join Gudyali and his family at their institute in New Jersey, the prosecutor argued, Gudyali had brought the girl under, quote, his mental domination, quote, he absorbed her personality and addicted her will. During the cross-examination of her, Gudyali's attorneys reminded Geraldine that her employer had given her a bicycle, he had taught her how to drive, he encouraged her to speak before audiences. She had had many opportunities to flee as they traveled by train across the country. Why hadn't she? Again, Geraldine insisted that she had been, quote, under some trance, curiously, for the entire 11 months of her employment. So in my limited time, I just want to focus my remarks on this strange convergence between the figure of mesmerism with contractual obligation in the case. So mesmerism, I argue, conjures a specter of anti-will, will-lessness, or failure of agency that seems to haunt the modern contract in the early 20th century, at the height of the Lochner era in the decades of, after emancipation. Emancipation having been invested with the hope of marking society's progressive movement from status to contract in Henry Maine's famous pronouncement. So in Geraldine's testimony, mesmerism appears at times as a critique of the employment contract, particularly the contract for industrial wage labor through which growing numbers of men and women surrendered a great deal of physical autonomy or control over their bodies to the automated rhythms and ruthlessness of production. Charles Poyen, the son of a Caribbean plantation owner who's sometimes credited with bringing mesmerism to the United States in the 19th century, in fact recommended it as a technique to New England factory owners, as a technique for the efficient management of new industrial labors. And his demonstrations featured a somnambulating factory girl brought into the discipline of factory work. At other times, mesmerism appears in Gudyali's case almost as a parody for the marriage contract. So the traditional marriage contract was, of course, different from other commercial contracts in that by entering into marriage, freely contracting individuals were regressed to status-like positions of husband and wife. Quote, by marriage, William Blackstone explained in his classic treatise, husband and wife are one. The very being of or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, end quote. So a woman who agrees to marriage, quote, hath given herself up unto her husband, end quote. Consent at the one time then becomes consent for all time. The trance in which Ms. McCann seemed to find herself, that's Geraldine, during the whole 11 months of her employment is perhaps not unlike the suspension of personhood that describes the legal status of married women. And indeed, the question that seemed to loom over the curious contract in Gudyali's case was the same question that seemed to vex women's entry into the workforce generally at the time. Did a woman's consent at work mean the same thing that it meant at home? In Canada, such anxiety motivated the adoption of the white women's labor laws, barring women from working specifically in for Chinese and Japanese employers. And labor organizers in the US in the early 20th century had proposed similar legislation. Okay, so let me jump ahead now for a moment to reveal not what really happened in this case, because I don't think we can know, but to share with you the outcome of Gudyali's trial, as well as his counter-narrative before arriving at my own conclusion. So white slave narratives were conventionally structured around a reveal. In the popular film Traffic in Souls, for instance, a handsome suitor is revealed to be a kidnapper, a Swedish benevolent society is really a brothel, and the loudest anti-vice campaigner is the leader of a massive sex trafficking syndicate. In Gudyali's case, the prosecution argued similarly that Gudyali's wife and daughter were really procurers, his home was really a harem, and that Gudyali himself was a sex trafficker. The jury found the prosecution's narrative convincing. The Ninth Circuit declined to overturn the jury's finding, and Gudyali himself was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He eventually received a presidential pardon, which is a different story. Gudyali's counter-narrative is also structured around a counter-reveal. So in his case, unlike most white slavery cases, a young woman really was kidnapped and robbed of her freedom, but in Gudyali's telling, not by Gudyali himself, but by her family. In his account, when Geraldine's mother became ill, her family members simply wanted her to come home and take care of the household. The White Slavery Act, in Gudyali's account, was very simply a tool used to remand newly mobilized women, especially white women, to domestic drudgery. So at the turn of the century, debates about contract and spiritualism, I think, seem to mirror one another in that they shared a set of interests and anxieties. Both were concerned with the nature of autonomy or agency, the nature of interpersonal influence or exchange, and both seem to draw from a common vocabulary of will, consent, and influence. As Amy Drew Stanley has written after the abolition of slavery, quote, contract was above all a metaphor for freedom, representing a release from bonds of domination and dependence. Contract stood for the possibility of reorganizing society according to the desires of free and formally equal people. In the late 19th century, contract drew its legitimacy from this ideal or this faith that contracts represent the mutual intentions of contracting parties. But it was the convergence of wills that supposedly animated the expansion of industrial capitalism during this period. But as critics observed by the early 20th century, the, quote, will theory of contract no longer corresponded to the real experience of those bound by contract to increasingly brutal working conditions. As working class people found themselves abandoned to increasingly automated economies of exchange, spiritualism seemed to offer its practitioners more vital opportunities for exploring the limits of agency, often by spectacularizing powerlessness and control. So it's not hard to imagine the ways in which at a mesmeric demonstration, for instance, the spectacle of a master puppeting a young woman around the room might have appeared as a kind of visual satire, revealing a kind of powerlessness authorized by contract at work and at home. Spiritualism also engaged a set of tensions constitutive of the liberal contract, specifically a tension between freedom and embodiment. Writing of the surrogacy contract, for instance, Patricia Williams observed that for a surrogate mother who changes her mind, the exercise of an original freedom paradoxically culminates in physical and psychic bondage. And she uses the term anti-will to connect histories of slavery with rape and forced motherhood. In liberal contract theory, the authority of contractual obligation is grounded to a particular construction of the contracting agent as sovereign in his isolation. For social contract theorists in particular, individuals forfeit this original perfect freedom to enter into the social contract. Freedom in this sense terminates in contract and community. Spiritualists, again, entertained a radically different set of intuitions, namely that we experience freedom not in isolation, but in community. For spiritualists, consensual exchange originates not with self-possession and isolation, but in the invisible, but nonetheless material conditions in which we find ourselves already embedded. Unlike the contracting agent of liberalism, the mesmerist and his subject are born already swimming in the substance and circumstance of others. Hannah Arendt located in this substance a dimension of public life that she called the space of appearance, the generation of collective power. quote, "The only indispensable material factor in the generation of power is the living together of people. Whenever people gather, it's potentially there, but only potentially, not necessarily, and not forever," end quote. So what made spiritualism so appealing to a variety of social reformers in the 19th century was the adorable notion that a universal substance, sometimes called magnetism, flowed among human beings without regard to distinctions of race, class, or gender. And in Gudyali's scientific demonstrations, for instance, as his son recounted to me, white doctors would defer to Gudyali as his master, white women would bare their shoulders so that he could paint their skin with colored lights. The scene of scientific demonstration that he describes would become an occasion for suspending the usual order as individuals crossed lines of social difference and rehearsed possibilities of radically alternative arrangements and intimacies. This fragile possibility, this other convergence of wills, I want to suggest, was the real source of scandal that resulted in Gudyali's imprisonment. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marisha Wickremsinhe, and I'm a research associate at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. And on behalf of Maggie Little, who's the director of Georgetown's Kennedy Institute of Ethics, and Annie Lyerly, our colleague at UNC, who's the associate director of their Center for Bioethics, I want to talk to you all today about some of the work we're doing around understanding the ethics of various risk-benefit trade-offs that are encountered in research conducted with pregnant women. So before we dig in, I just want to acknowledge the grants that Maggie, Annie, and I work on that make this research possible. The first is PHASES, which is funded by the NIH, and the second is PREVENT, which is funded by the Wellcome Trust. So just to begin, to set the stage, why do we need to do research with pregnant women? I think the quickest way to answer that is to talk a little bit about the Zika virus crisis. So this is a photo of a baby born with microcephaly near Recife, Brazil, which had a really high rate of Zika virus transmission in early 2016. And as many of you likely know, the most significant effects of Zika virus occur when a pregnant woman is infected, and that infection is then transferred to the fetus in utero, and it causes a constellation of symptoms, including microcephaly, known as congenital Zika syndrome. For the rest of the population, infection is generally mild, if not asymptomatic. So it seems an obvious point then that pregnant women should be at the center of any research response that the global health community initiates to address Zika. But it might surprise you all to learn that in every clinical trial that has been put forth for the Zika virus vaccines that are currently under development, pregnant women have been excluded. So that means that when these vaccines come to market, we don't have any data on the safety and efficacy of how these vaccines work in pregnancy. So without that data, what can we tell women who are concerned about contracting Zika and really just looking to protect themselves and their future offspring from infection? This photograph was taken in Guatemala City, and it depicts pregnant women who are waiting at an antenatal clinic actually to get a Zika screening test in 2016. So it seems that even when pregnant women are sort of central to the need for developing a new preventive or treatment, pregnant women are excluded from the research, right? And that's because there's this widespread reticence to include pregnant women in the research agenda amongst the scientific community. So what are the reasons for this reticence? There are many, and there are a lot of different factors that play into that in different ways, but the one that I want to talk to you about today is the lack of clarity around the ethically acceptable risk-benefit trade-offs that are encountered when conducting research with pregnant women. So pregnant women are, of course, a very complex research population. The woman and the fetus are biologically intertwined, which is to say that any intervention you seek to initiate on one will in some way, shape, or form affect the other, whether minimally or significantly, right? And this is an especially challenging question for the research enterprise, which is mostly used to dealing with research-related risks and benefits that accrue to a single entity, right? So how do we understand these risk-benefit trade-offs when they occur across parties between the woman, the fetus, or the future child? So First, I just want to acknowledge that this is a consensus issue, regardless of perspectives on the moral status of the fetus. The vast majority of research involving pregnant women deals with pregnancies that are carried to term, right? So the health of a future child is implicated, and that we can agree matters and should be considered. And second, I just want to note that in a lot of cases of research with pregnant women, any prospect of benefit to the woman often leads to a prospect of benefit to the fetus, because as OBs often say, what's best for the fetus is a healthy mom, right? That said, when this isn't the case, we encounter 3 challenging trade-off scenarios. So the first is a case of maternal risk and fetal benefit. So an example of this would be, for example, an HIV medication that might increase the risk of suicidal ideation in the woman, but decrease the chance of transmission of HIV from the mother to the child, right? So interestingly, actually recently published international ethics guidelines that are influential but not legally enforceable have actually asserted that if there's no prospect of benefit to the woman, she shouldn't be permitted to volunteer any more than minimal risk to her, even if there's prospect of direct benefit to the fetus. And our group thinks that, frankly, that's a bit ridiculous and deeply paternalistic, because we believe that, like any other competent agent, a pregnant woman should be permitted to altruistically volunteer risk, even in a trial that doesn't pose the prospect of direct benefit to her. In this case, the prospect of direct benefit of her participation accrues to the fetus, which she just happens to be carrying. So it's a kind of a win-win. So the next scenario that we encounter that's a bit more challenging, I would say, is one of fetal risk and maternal benefit. So this would be a scenario in which a medication might more effectively treat the woman's illness, but there are unknown risks to the fetus if we were to administer that drug during pregnancy. So, as I said, this scenario is especially ethically complex, largely because the fetus can't consent to taking on those risks, right? That said, we believe that a woman's decision to continue her pregnancy should not require that she forfeit her right to access medical benefit, right? That is to say that the presence of the fetus can't displace her own health needs. Of course, the question then becomes how much benefit to the woman can justify how much risk to the fetus. And Maggie wanted me to note here that we need feminists to do really good work on this. So if anyone has any ideas, please let me know. Would love to hear your thoughts. And so the last risk-benefit trade-off, which is particularly interesting, is this risk of pregnancy loss when there's a prospect of direct benefit to the future child. So this is I'll just explain with an example, again, returning to the HIV case. There are medications on the market, or rather that should be addressed with research with pregnant women, that might increase the risk of fetal demise or even stillbirth, but that actually reduce the rate of mother-to-child transmission of HIV, right? So there's this chance of losing the fetus or the baby, but if the fetus survives, they're HIV-free, right? So that's a really interesting kind of tension. And we believe that pregnant women will reasonably differ in the priority that they place on avoiding pregnancy loss versus improving the health of the future child, right? And so this is a challenging one because you can't really make a blanket policy here around how this risk-benefit trade-off should be understood, but we believe that researchers should elicit the values of pregnant women who are participating in these trials that present this risk-benefit trade-off and ensure that those values are respected based on context or personal preference. So our team is working on developing an ethics framework to understand these trade-offs to ensure that clinical research is responsive to the health needs of pregnant women and their offspring. I'll leave you with that. Thanks so much for listening. I look forward to answering your questions. And also please follow us on Twitter because I run the account and we need more followers.
Yes, thank you. Just trying to have the clock in front of me so that I don't speak too much. So first of all, thank you very much for having me here, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I've been learning so much. I spend my day, half of the time I see patients with breast cancer. I'm a medical oncologist at Lombardi. I see patients as well that are on phase 1 clinical trials, and half of the time I do research. And I came here to just briefly talk about some of the projects we are doing and to address very important questions. So this is what I'll cover in the next minutes. And I would just start by looking at the 10 leading cancer types in the US. And let's focus on the right side. And we can see that breast is the most frequent type of cancer in women and is the second cause of death by cancer in women. But if we take a look at incidence and death rates by race and ethnicity, we can see that there are very significant differences. And although historically the incidence rate of breast cancer has been higher in white women, and we can see that in the yellow curve, we can see that more recently the yellow curve has converged with the red curve that represents the incidence rate of breast cancer in black women. And then on purple we can see the curve of Hispanic women, and then on blue we have Asian, Pacific, and with much less incidence than the others. But now what is very significant is that if we look at the death rates, although the incidence rate historically has been higher in white women, the death rates have been much higher in black women. So especially if we see that the incidence rates that used to be higher in white women now has converged, we see that the gap in breast cancer incidence and death, particularly in death, will just continue, is just increasing. And we can see as well, because I'll focus or I'll talk a little bit about Latinas as well, that although the death rate, the curve in black women and white women has been declining over time, we see that the one for Hispanic has been quite stable in the last years, and there's a lot to do to try to understand why this is going on. So if we look at these picture from Dali and Olopadi et al. That have been doing a lot of work on this, we can see that probably, and my goal is not that you can read everything that is there, okay, and I'll guide you, but to show you that there are so many factors that come together and cause this perfect storm. And probably we can lump those in two categories. One, tumor biology, that is related to certain characteristics of the tumors that are different, of the cancers that are different in different races and ethnicities. But others, unfortunately, and probably those are the ones that we can do more about it, have to do with patterns of care and access to care. So when we look with more detail, on the top we have causes and solutions related to tumor biology and tumor genomics, for instance. So in tumor biology, we know for facts today that black women and Latinas have more aggressive subtypes of breast cancer. Black women have more triple negatives, and at a younger age, Latinas have more hormone receptor negative that usually are more aggressive than the hormone receptor positive subtypes. But on the right, all that we know about the BRCA genes or BRCA1 and 2 genes that Angelina Jolie told us years ago that she had one, there are different frequencies in different populations. Not only that, but we know as well that what certain populations decide to do when they know about a positive test is different as well. So that will play a role in their outcomes. But then, and on the bottom of these slides, the ones that probably we can have more impact, delays in treatments and the underuse of treatments, and so many reasons for that, problems in access, patient navigation, physician communication, and patient and community education and engagement. And we'll go over it in a little bit more detail. So these are just some of the solutions. Clinical trial redesign, as Marisha mentioned, how are we including everybody that needs to be included? Precision medicine are these large initiatives being focused just in a part of the population or covering everybody. On the right, improve physician communication. So our physicians and the other healthcare professionals trained or culturally trained to serve the populations they see, improved access and navigation, and then make sure that we involve the communities and academic centers in all the interventions that are developed. So just I'll show you here 2 studies that we have recently developed at Georgetown to trying to address just a little bit of this huge problem, and that a lot of people have been trying to find solutions. One is the uptake study that actually my mentor is Dr. Christy Graves, that was here in for the first panel. And it's about looking at decision-making and patterns of care in Latina women with BRCA1 and 2 mutations. So just to give you a little bit of background, mutations are harmful changes, because sometimes there are changes in the genes that don't do anything, but here we are talking about harmful changes that on those people that have them increase the risk of breast and ovarian cancer and are passed down in families. But knowing this and learning about this gives us an opportunity to reduce the risk, either by doing more screening, doing MRIs, or starting screening earlier, or actually to suggest some surgeries that can decrease the risk. So if we don't know, we cannot discuss that with the women. If we know, we have a chance to act, or at least tell the women what their options are. Unfortunately, here as well, there are significant disparities, not only in testing, but as well what women decide. And here I have to tell that although there's a lot of controversy about the role of mastectomy, or of having the breasts removed, in terms of having the ovaries removed after the age 40 or after the women have their children, there's definitive evidence that improves survival. So we are not talking about a minor thing. And the data that is available shows that white women and educated women are more likely to undergo these preventive surgeries than other women, and the question is why. And although there is some data already in black women, there's just very tiny data in very small numbers in Latinas. So what we did was we interviewed 100 Latinas known to have BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutations, and we did telephone surveys to ask them what they decided to do and why. So we are trying to understand, even if with a small sample, why. Is this the country of origin? Is this because they receive the genetic counseling and testing in a language that they don't understand what is going on? Is this concerns about what it means to have a mutation? So this is just preliminary results. We are going to present our data in December in a breast cancer meeting in San Antonio, but these are just preliminary results about characterizing our population. Half are US born, half came from the other countries that you can see on the left. Only 1/4 received genetic counseling in Spanish, and I can tell you that more than that mentioned in the interview that Spanish is the preferred language. And you can understand just from a little bit of what I told you, there are so many implications of knowing that you have a mutation. Now imagine hearing that in a language that you don't fully understand, or through a translator is quite challenging. And on the right, BSO stands for bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy. That means removal of the ovaries. Shows how many decided, but for us, once again, we are doing multivariate analysis to try to understand who decided to do so and why, or if we find factors. The second project, it's a study called Palina trial, is ongoing and has to do with clinical trial participation in minorities. So just to give you a very quick background, this has to do with a new drug called palbociclib that has been approved for treatment of breast cancer. The way it acts in a very important step that controls cell growth. But what is most amazing, it's a drug that was received an accelerated approval by the FDA, so it tells you that it's quite promising. They don't do that that often, but it doubles the time that a woman with breast cancer that has spread to outside the breast is doing well without evidence of the progression of disease. So doubling is quite impressive. We are talking about, being 2 years doing well from 2 to 4, or approximate, those numbers approximately. Has as a major side effect that the cells that fight infections can go down and and quite significantly, although the women are doing just fine. But when they do their regular checkup, so your white blood counts are low. Why does this matter? And before I tell you why does this matter, just to give you a little bit a snapshot of what happens in terms of minorities. They are historically underrepresented in clinical trials. This is not new, unfortunately, for many different reasons. And I have to tell you that depending if we are talking about Black women or Latinas, the reasons are different. And I just mentioned here different ones: mistrust, inefficient recruitment methods, insurance issues, co-pays, so many others. And consequences are huge. So lack of evidence that actually what is being approved applies to all the populations, as you are mentioning about pregnant women. So clinical trials are just increasing disparities instead of helping. So in particularly with palbociclib, we know that African American women more often have a condition called benign ethnic neutropenia. That is, their counts are already low to start with, but it does not necessarily mean that they have a higher risk of infections. So this puts a huge problem in terms of this medication for two reasons. One is that physicians might decide not to give this drug to African American women because they are concerned that their counts will drop more, or they might give, and we actually don't know because these patients were not enrolled in the clinical trials. We might not know actually if it's safe. So what we suggested was just let's do a simple trial that mimics real-world conditions, but will pay very careful attention to the white blood counts and the risk of infections, and actually if the drug is working as well as has been shown in the clinical trials where African American women were not enrolled or were enrolled in a very small number, and to provide that evidence so that we know for sure what we are doing. And it's currently enrolling patients here and at Hospital Center and 2 other MedStar hospitals in Baltimore, and is going to open at 2 other hospitals in the country in the next month. So these were just examples, and in particular the Palina trial is trying to address underuse of treatment. We don't want to say no to a drug that might have a tremendous benefit, but and with this we are trying to shape clinical trial redesign. Why? Make things more simple, explain why it's important for you in particular, this patient, to participate, and improve physician communication as well. And as well, help with the access. The drug is provided, it's for free, but it's mimicking world condition, the same thing that the patient would have outside the clinical trial. So this, just to end with these 2 examples, to say that I think, in the years that I've been practicing, I think there is things have been changing. The NIH has been putting a lot of pressure in academic centers to address these issues, that minorities are not being represented in clinical trials. A lot of societies have been focusing on this. So I think that there is hope in the future that things will be better done and will address some of these issues. So thank you very much.
So we turn it over to the floor for questions. This was great. This is all about consent. Women being able to consent.
I have a question for the third presenter. You talked about you talked about risks and benefits and how the women needed to make the decision based on sort of what they thought was more important for them. And I'm just wondering because I recently did these modules for the IRB, and there's this whole thing on risks and benefits and what that means as kind of a human rights issue. And I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit more on that.
Yeah, so to clarify, there are kind of 2 aspects to this. So first are the risks that as a research enterprise, we should even be willing to ask people to agree to, right? So there's a whole literature on that, and that's kind of about making sure that the risks are as minimal as possible to achieve the scientific aims that are beneficial to the person and to society. And so that's like one section of the conversation around risks and benefits. And then there's this other section around how individuals can or should be offered the opportunity to take on those risks or benefits, right? So to be clear, in the context of pregnant women volunteering, were you referring specifically to the scenario in which the fetus would benefit and the woman would agree to take on the risk? Absolutely. So in that context, it's important to note that the research enterprise should already ensure that those risks are as minimal as possible to achieve the desired aims, right? So this isn't to say, like, we shouldn't be asking women to do, I don't know how to frame this without saying something that I shouldn't. So I'm gonna reel it in. So we shouldn't ask women to volunteer any risk that would be unacceptable for any other population, or that would essentially break the public's trust with the research enterprise, right? But what we are saying is that, like any other competent agent, if that woman wants to take on, is informed, and wants to take on a minimized risk that the research enterprise is offering, she should be permitted to do that on behalf of benefits that would accrue to the fetus. So, does that answer your question? Okay, great. Yeah, it's hard to do in 10 minutes.
Just a comment or question for the first two speakers. I was kind of amazed about the amount of overlap there in terms of the research projects. And I was wondering if there's any collaboration presently or maybe planned.
We just met.
Not yet.
Yeah, but like, you know, it was
Yeah, but I'm gonna send you
crazy
my paper.
overlap. I would like to quote it because she explains things. Sherally
Okay,
explains
let's
things so
start.
much more lovely
Let's start
than I do.
tweeting out hashtag G+JI magic.
But there was so much overlap with these sort of questions. I mean, and it's interesting to put them with your papers, right? Because so in some ways we're fundamentally questioning the value of words like consent and agency and will, and then you guys have to invest in giving people more will and valuing consent and things like that. So it's just, I just really also think there's conversations to be had around and across those moments too, right? And especially as we're both dealing with law as well, which both, you know, we're supposed to like fundamentally invest in these things, right? And then at the same time in sort of our humanistic inquiry are like, but really, is the problem the thing, right? Is the problem agency and consent? And the fact that those concepts might be sort of like bankrupt to their core, right? Is I find fascinating as a way of sort of like, how can we talk across disciplines to maintain sort of a skepticism and a criticism, a critique around those at the same time that we're like deeply invested in being like, but there's health disparities, right? That need to be addressed under a current system that can understand things like will and consent in complex ways, right? So.
I mean, for me, it's just taken a while to recognize the ways in which like consent is a category, and as you said, a kind of fabulation, and one that has done a lot of work within liberalism to sort of compensate for actually its opposite, right? Like a lack of consent, agency, and will. And so I think the value of this kind of interdisciplinary exchange is also then to think critically about the ways in which categories like will, agency circulate. Yeah, and I mean, and between our projects, I'm not unmindful of the way in which in our, you know, the kind of disaster that we've seen unfold in the last couple of days, you know, about sort of like a violation of agency, consent in the workplace is also sort of seems to resonate with what we've been talking about right now.
But also the way that like centering the complex subject versus like the universal male laborer or the like centering the pregnant woman in questions of ethical trials, right? Centering under-resourced populations and the way we think about treating breast cancer, right? Fundamentally changes the questions that we ask about those issues in the first place, right? And should, right? So rather than thinking of those as like other or marginal to the question, they become central, and that's sort of what I think we're all interested in as well, right? Where it's just like, okay, well, if the labor contract has been centered on this idea of like a male laborer, right?
Or disembodied
Yes,
subject.
right. Well, which I feel like
Is a
really
male
isn't,
labor, right.
you know, disembodied, right? Because then in other ways it becomes the marriage contract, which I didn't get a chance to talk about, becomes, which you did, which was wonderful, becomes this way of just being like, you know, her Baartman's captor, you know, slash owner, slash manager marries her because then all the questions go away. Then he can do whatever he wants with her and to her, and it is legal, right? So the marriage is the cover for evacuating any sort of role of consent, right? That's pretty phenomenal, right, as a conversation to think about, even though that has been going on for a long time about marriage contract, but to think about its relationship to the labor contract.
So I had I'm very interested. Thank you for this very stimulating conversation, and I've been learning a lot about the historical narrative. And since you kind of went there, part of the reason I'm here today is because I would like to know, you know, you both talked about agency and contract, and you mentioned the age of contract. What age are we in now? I'm sure I don't just speak for myself when I say that part of the reason I'm here is to figure out what age we're in now, and or what age you think we may enter into.
I'm like, do you want to take that first? I mean, I can tell you what my project is both trying to critique. So I was attendant to this in sort of writing the second project and wanting to both sort of critique these concepts like contract and freedom and consent and sovereignty and are like the sort of role of my project and citizenship, right? But also say, well, then what does happen when we center the decentered subject, right? Does it have to be those things? And that is not to say we get rid of the idea of agency or consent altogether, but it less becomes sort of the goal. So, I mean, and again, this is just what I'm sort of working towards, which is if I think in my project of a genealogy of sort of Black women as political subjects, instead of thinking about them in a version of like, what do they gain, you know, what do they lack compared to what we think of as an ideal citizen? If we think about Black women as our ideal citizen, then suddenly like embodied vulnerability becomes the norm and not the thing that we're correcting, which is not to say it's okay, but to say it's the thing that we're investigating, right? And that we assume goes across populations, right? So for me, my answer is, what does a politics look like if it's built on an assumption of vulnerability rather than an assumption of an ideal, invulnerable, free subject, right? If we assume at the first that the subject is not consenting, not free, not, you know, not, what does that do to our concept of politics, right? So for me, that's like, well, I want to know what politics looks like if we move from there, rather than assuming that what we're trying to do is run away from there and there's some other norm that if we gain access to rights, we're all going to get, right? And that's just sort of what I'm sort of interested in looking at in my project as a sort of political genealogy. But
I mean, I think that's how I'm going to answer your question. So I think as I've been kind of rereading some critical literature about the ways in which concepts like freedom and equality were reformulated in the aftermath of slavery, I think when I reread that critical scholarship, I recognize the way in which what we call neoliberalism kind of originated in that moment, right? And so Saartjie Hartman, who writes really beautifully about this work, uses the phrase the burdened individuality of freedom to describe the thing that was imposed on emancipated African Americans, right? And that became a form of culpability, you know, indenture, that sort of thing, criminalization, criminality, right? And so it's a kind of subjecthood that is conferred only as liability or something like that. And I think we can recognize the way in which a term like responsibility, for instance, kind of does that same work within what we kind of can recognize as a neoliberal order, you know? And so I think remembering the ways in which liberalism was rearticulated in a totally racialized idiom at that moment can be helpful for thinking about the ways in which, that racial, gendered disequilibrium persists,
Hi. So the first two talks talked about kind of men having control over women's consent. Can you talk about a little bit about the paternal consent in pregnancy trials or clinical trials?
Yeah, definitely. So it's really interesting that you brought that up because some of the folks on our grant on the UNC team actually just interviewed something like 150 women in Baltimore and Chapel Hill, the Triangle, those places, that area. And so 70 women from Baltimore and that area of North Carolina, and 70 women from Malawi on their perspectives around whether or not the father of the child or the father of the fetus should be included in decisions around their participation in research, right? And so before I get to kind of what they've found, the regulations, subpart B, that govern govern human subjects research in the US require that the father of the fetus be asked for consent if and only if the research benefits only the fetus. So it's a very obscure category that actually is not at all analogous to the consent requirements for pediatric research, which stipulates that both parents need to consent only if there is no benefit to the child. So again, if there's no benefit to the fetus, the pregnant woman can volunteer, whether there's benefit to her or not. So it's this kind of incongruous situation when compared to subpart D, which is what governs pediatric research. But one of the things that we've found, or I shouldn't say we, our team has found, is that a lot of the responses around whether or not the father should be sort of invited to comment depend on, again, the woman's relationship, understandably, to the father of the child. And also there seems to be a general consensus that women should be permitted to consult with the father of the child if they so choose, but that her consent alone should justify her participation in the research. And there are case studies from across the world of women wanting to participate in research, but the father of the fetus saying, pregnant women wanting to participate in research, but the father of the fetus saying, no, you can't. And that's obviously, I think we can all agree that that seems very problematic. So it's a really tough decision. It varies contextually. We were at a conference in Argentina that brought together researchers from across the world. And people were upset about this issue. This was a big thing that people wanted to talk about, whether or not the father should have a say in whether or not the pregnant woman participates. So yeah, it's a really interesting question. Again, in the US, I think it's arguably less of a concern, given that it's just a very small category, an obscure but small category of research. So research that only benefits the fetus. But yeah, it's a really good question.
Wonderful. What is your name? Yeah. Okay, Jessica Phillips Silver from the Department of Neuroscience. I just want us to really dwell on this, and I think we should do another event on what era are we in. And I just want to say what I think we are witnessing right here is we are in the era of data, of research, of it coming from different perspectives and languages and methodologies from people who come from diverse backgrounds. And, it's taken us a bit to even bring together something around the hub of gender justice. And that's not for lack of trying, right? So I think the era that we're in is to speak as unapologetically as everyone has here and as our students are speaking in Red Square. So with that, I want to thank this table.
And I just want to take a moment to thank Laura, who's been doing all this work too. So thank you for doing this.